What do you call a machine that flew a perfect mission, landed itself with no pilot, and was better engineered than its American rival, and then got destroyed by a leaking roof? The Soviets called it Buran. And its story doesn't end in a crash. It ends somewhere much stranger. In the early 1970s, the Soviet Union noticed something that worried them. The United States was building a brand new spacecraft, reusable, capable of carrying huge payloads, and able to land like an airplane. It was called the Space Shuttle. Soviet military analysts didn't see a science project. They saw a threat. Some believed the shuttle's massive cargo bay could be used to snatch Soviet satellites out of orbit, or even to drop nuclear weapons on Soviet territory from space. That fear alone was enough to trigger one of the most expensive engineering programs in Soviet history. Their answer was a spacecraft that looked almost identical to the American shuttle, so identical, in fact, that Soviet engineers had partly obtained the American design through espionage. But looks were where the similarities ended. What they built next would end up outperforming the machine it was designed to copy. The program was called Buran, Russian for Snowstorm. It launched in 1974, led by chief designer Gleb Lozino-Lazinski, and it grew into a scale almost impossible to imagine today. More than 1,000 companies across the entire Soviet Union were pulled into the project, factories, universities, research institutes, all working toward a single machine. Unlike the American shuttle, which used its own engines to reach orbit, Buran was designed to ride into space strapped to the side of Energia, a super heavy-lift rocket so powerful it remains, even decades later, one of the most capable launch vehicles ever built. This gave Buran an advantage its American twin never had. Energia could fly on its own, carrying other massive payloads, even without Buran attached. Construction began in 1980. Engineers built a full-scale atmospheric test version first, nicknamed OKGLI, fitted with jet engines so it could take off and land under its own power, the same way NASA had tested its own prototype years earlier. Test pilots flew it again and again, refining every system. By the mid-1980s, the real orbiter was taking shape. Over 38,000 individual heat-resistant tiles were bonded to its underside, each one custom-fit, designed to survive the extreme heat of re-entry up to 100 times. The total cost of the program would eventually reach an estimated 20 billion rubles, at the time, one of the largest sums the Soviet Union had ever spent on a single engineering project. Every ruble of it was riding on a single question: could this thing actually fly? On November 15, 1988, under a veil of secrecy, Buran finally launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, strapped to the side of Energia. No crew. No life support system. Just a machine, flying entirely on its own. Here's what made this moment historic. Nobody on Earth had ever landed a spacecraft like this fully automatically before. Not the Americans. Not anyone. Buran orbited the planet twice, re-entered the atmosphere, and guided itself down through crosswinds to a precise landing on the runway at Baikonur, no human hands on the controls, from launch to touchdown. It lost only 8 of its 38,000 heat tiles during the entire flight. The mission lasted 206 minutes. And when it rolled to a stop, Buran had just achieved something the American shuttle program never even attempted: a fully autonomous orbital spaceflight. For one moment, it looked like the Soviet Union had built the most advanced spacecraft on Earth. But triumph has terrible timing sometimes. 3 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. And when a country disappears, so does its budget. Funding for Buran dried up almost overnight. 2 more orbiters were already under construction. One, nicknamed Tichka, was more than 90% complete. But there was no more money, no more government to answer to, and increasingly, no more reason. In 1993, Russian President Boris Yeltsin officially mothballed the entire program. Buran, the machine that had just proven itself better than its American rival, never flew again. It was rolled into a hangar at Baikonur, parked next to a mock-up of the Energia rocket, and left there, waiting for a second mission that was never coming. For almost a decade, Buran sat in the dark, gathering dust. The hangar wasn't maintained, there was no money for that either. Kazakhstan's extreme climate battered the building year after year, swinging from -40 degrees Celsius in winter to +40 in summer. Then, on May 12, 2002, during a violent storm, the roof gave out. It collapsed directly onto Buran and the Energia mock-up beside it. 8 workers who were inside at the time were killed. The only Soviet spacecraft to have ever flown a full automated orbital mission was crushed under its own storage building. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a design flaw in the spacecraft itself. It was something almost more tragic, simple neglect, in a country that could no longer afford to protect what it had built. 2 more Buran-class vehicles still exist today. One is a ground test model. The other, Tichka, the one that was 90% ready to fly, still sits in a different hangar at Baikonur, exposed to dust, extreme heat, and bird droppings, more than 3 decades later. And here's where the story gets almost unbelievable. Ownership of these last 2 Burans eventually passed to a Kazakh businessman. According to reporting at the time, he reportedly offered to trade one of them for the skull of Kazakhstan's last Khan, held in a foreign museum. A piece of Soviet space history, bartered like an artifact in a private collection. Buran proved something remarkable in 1988, that a spacecraft could fly and land itself with zero human input, decades before anyone thought that kind of autonomy was possible. And then it was left to rot, not because the engineering failed, but because the country behind it did. So which failure is harder to accept, a machine that never got the chance to fly, or a machine that proved itself perfect, and still ended up buried under its own roof? Tell me which one hits harder in the comments. This is Unbuilt History. Subscribe, because the story after this one might be even stranger.